April 1945 brought a bitter chill to the American South, but in the pine-scented air around Camp Ruston, Louisiana, the cold could not compare to the tension that gripped the women arriving under military escort. Each step across the mud-caked red clay roads was measured, hesitant, as if the earth itself knew the weight of the lives it now carried. Among these prisoners was a young German woman, her civilian clothes drenched from the relentless spring rain, her blonde hair plastered against her face, and her belly visibly swollen with a child born into the chaos of a collapsing nation. She was 24, a former nurse, carrying the last remnants of a personal life obliterated by war. Her journey had begun with the disintegration of her hometown, the deafening collapse of structures once vibrant with everyday life, and the merciless demands of a defeated military that left civilians like her exposed to the tide of occupation and imprisonment. The camp's barbed fences and towering guard posts loomed ahead, a visible assertion of authority and an implicit promise of uncertainty. American soldiers moved in disciplined, casual patterns, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes scanning, yet betraying no expression that could hint at the fates of the newcomers. The woman's hand instinctively rested upon her stomach, feeling the faint, tentative movements of her unborn child, small flutters that contrasted starkly with the oppressive uncertainty of the environment. Each step carried both the hope that life inside her might continue and the dread that the enemy surrounding her could determine otherwise. As she was guided toward the processing building, her senses absorbed the strange newness of the camp, the smell of clean air mixed with the pine of the forest, the sound of birds she did not recognize, the subtle rhythm of water dripping from eaves onto the saturated earth. Inside the building, the contrast was immediate and almost surreal. Officers sat behind desks, paperwork stacked, typewriters clicking. Names, ages, origins, and backgrounds were recorded with methodical precision. For a moment, it seemed the machinery of bureaucracy might be indifferent to individual stories, yet the officer who finally addressed her paused, noting the obvious pregnancy with careful observation. His questions were deliberate, her due date, her health, any concerns. The woman's responses were cautious, measured. She did not fully trust the tones that seemed neutral, nor the attention that appeared attentive. A deep-seated fear of abandonment, of punitive disregard lingered as a shadow behind every word she spoke. Despite this, a subtle undercurrent of care became apparent when she was instructed to see a doctor the following day. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, yet in the midst of her exhaustion, fear, and grief, it offered a fragile thread of hope that would soon be tested. The camp itself unfolded around her, not as a place of violence, but as a complex, structured environment where the mundane, food preparation, barracks assignments, sanitation, intersected with the extraordinary circumstances of captivity. The smell of freshly cooked meals drifted through corridors, a sensory contradiction to the stories of scarcity she had internalized over years of war. Each step, each sensory cue forced her to reconcile the reality that survival might be offered by those she had been taught to view as the enemy. The roads, slick with rain, reflected the muted gray sky above, and each puddle seemed to carry echoes of a world she had lost. As she navigated the pathways between barracks and medical facilities, the presence of other women, some weary, some silent with apprehension, reminded her that she was not alone in her vulnerability. Yet isolation persisted, carried in the unspoken judgment of her peers and the silent assumptions surrounding her pregnancy and captivity. At that moment, the tension of past war experiences collided with the immediate uncertainties of life in the camp, creating a landscape both external and internal, where every breath, every heartbeat became a negotiation between fear and hope. The unbroken rain mirrored the relentless passage of time, each drop a quiet witness to the fragile persistence of life, even as it moved under the gaze of guards whose intentions could only be inferred, never known. This young woman, navigating a world she had never wished to enter, began the first steps of a journey where the convergence of human judgment, medical expertise, and the faint yet persistent flame of hope would decide not only her fate, but the fate of the life she carried within her.
The air hung heavy with anticipation, the scent of damp earth mingling with the unknown. Each measured movement brought her closer to the medical intervention that could either sustain life or confirm the feared loss. And as she lifted her eyes to the interior of the processing building, she felt the gravity of history pressing down, a reminder that the consequences of this moment extended far beyond her personal existence, touching on the broader dimensions of humanity amidst the destruction of war.
The next morning, the young German woman was escorted to the camp medical facility, a low, elongated building marked by a large red cross painted on its roof, signaling a space both functional and profoundly consequential. Inside, the antiseptic odor was sharp and unfamiliar, mingled with the faint warmth of a building maintained with care despite the surrounding chaos of war. The facility was staffed with American medical personnel whose movements were precise, methodical, and yet unexpectedly compassionate, a duality that seemed almost impossible in a setting defined by captivity and past enmity. The woman's initial trepidation was immediate. Every footstep across the clean floors echoed the countless warnings she had internalized during the collapse of her nation, that those deemed unworthy, that prisoners of war, that the innocent and vulnerable might find no mercy at all. Yet here, in this strangely orderly environment, she was asked to lie on a table, to expose herself not to scrutiny for punishment, but to examination intended to preserve life. The doctor, a middle-aged man with graying temples and steady hands, began his assessment with quiet professionalism, speaking in broken German to bridge the gap between fear and understanding. His hands, trained over years of both civilian and wartime medicine, moved with deliberate care, checking the child's heartbeat, measuring the subtle rhythms that indicated life or the potential for imminent loss. The tension was palpable. She held her breath as his stethoscope traced the contours of her swollen belly, each second stretching longer than the last, every faint pulse a tenuous affirmation of existence. The room seemed to shrink, the walls enclosing her in a paradoxical sense of both security and threat. The doctor's expression remained calm but focused, his frown subtly deepening as he traced the irregularities that had begun to manifest. The woman's mind raced, reconstructing the medical knowledge she had accumulated as a nurse, recalling the signs of fetal distress, the grim realities of premature birth, and the fragility of life under insufficient care. Yet despite this, the subtle gestures, the adjustment of the stethoscope, the neutral but attentive questions, the soft reassurances communicated an unexpected concern for both mother and child. Outside the examination room, the sounds of camp life persisted, the distant footsteps of guards, the faint laughter or murmur of other women attending to assigned duties, the rhythmic clatter of kitchen utensils preparing sustenance that she herself had yet to fully digest in comprehension. The sensory layers compounded the tension inside the facility, grounding her in the stark reality that every decision, every assessment carried weighty consequences. She was acutely aware that the child she carried was dependent entirely on these strangers, that the balance between life and death rested in hands that had no obligation to favor mercy. And yet, the paradox of the situation pressed upon her. Her own nation had failed, leaving mothers and infants to perish amidst destruction, while here, within an enemy camp, life was being carefully measured, tended, and against all expectation, preserved. Each moment the doctor spent listening, calculating, and advising reinforced the gravity of the situation. He spoke of risks, of potential interventions, of monitoring that could determine survival, but never with judgment, only with an unwavering focus on sustaining the fragile pulse of life.
The woman's thoughts flickered to family and homeland, visions of ruined streets, devastated neighbors, absent loved ones, but these memories were eclipsed by the immediacy of her current predicament. She was trapped between worlds, the war that had shattered her past, the prison camp that dictated her present, and the uncertain future that lay in the heartbeat of a child who had already survived so much by mere circumstance. Time seemed both elastic and oppressive. Each second of measured assessment felt like an eternity, each sound or movement outside the room a reminder of the broader machinery of war that had brought her here. And yet, despite her fear, there was an unspoken thread of hope, fragile and nearly imperceptible, that began to root. The doctor's calm voice, the presence of trained hands committed to life rather than destruction, and the rhythmic, if faint, pulse of the child within her formed a nexus of tension and possibility. She understood, with the clarity born of desperation, that survival in this moment was neither guaranteed nor simple. It was contingent on vigilance, knowledge, and the unyielding choice of others to act with skill, patience, and perhaps even compassion. And as she lay there, palms pressed instinctively to her belly, she began to comprehend the profound weight of the decisions that awaited her and the medical staff alike, the careful navigation between intervention and observation, between risk and the potential for new life, decisions that would define not just the immediate outcome of her pregnancy, but the trajectory of a fragile, nascent life in a world scarred by unrelenting conflict.
Over the following days, the rhythm of camp life and medical observation intertwined, forming a delicate pattern that dictated both her physical movements and the state of her thoughts. She returned to the medical facility twice daily, each visit a calculated negotiation between fear and hope. The doctor's presence became a constant, stabilizing yet never entirely comforting, for every checkup reminded her of the precariousness of the life she carried. He spoke clinically of fetal heart rates, placental function, and oxygen supply, terms that she understood with increasing clarity, yet each measurement was a stark reminder that death was not merely a possibility, but a looming certainty if intervention failed or delay persisted. Outside the clinic, the camp continued in its own measured cadence, women performing laundry, scrubbing floors, preparing meals, and moving supplies through the barracks. Their work was punctuated by occasional laughter, murmured conversations, and the distant metallic clatter of the guards' routines. Yet for her, these background rhythms were both alien and isolating. She felt a separation from all mundane activity, tethered entirely to the fragile life within her. The contrast between the ordinary movements of the camp and the extraordinary precariousness of her pregnancy created a persistent dissonance that pressed against her senses. Sleep offered little relief. Nights were punctuated by sharp, fleeting pains that surged without warning, each one a reminder that the child could falter without notice. She pressed her hands against her belly in desperation, willing movement, tracking the faint shifts that indicated life persisted. The fear of failure was constant, gnawing at every thought, reinforced by the absence of her family and the knowledge of Germany's devastation. Letters from home, when they arrived, were thin and heavily censored, yet each conveyed suffering, scarcity, and uncertainty. She clutched them as both lifelines and weights, reading of neighbors who had perished, of streets reduced to rubble, of children surviving on bark and roots, and felt the stark contrast between those scenes and the relative security she now experienced. Even as the medical staff provided resources, warmth, and professional attention, guilt settled in with equal force, a counterweight to the hope she dared to hold. The psychological tension was compounded by the observation of other women in the camp, some quietly resigned, some tentatively adapting to the structured routines imposed upon them. Their faces reflected shared exhaustion, the subtle ways in which survival imposed both solidarity
and silent judgment. She noted small gestures, an extra portion of bread offered discreetly, a whispered word of encouragement, a glance of understanding that acknowledged her burden without needing explanation. These interactions formed a tenuous network of support, reinforcing the idea that life could still be sustained even when the machinery of war and punishment surrounded it. And yet, with each flutter that failed to manifest, with each faint irregularity detected in the heartbeat, the threat of irrevocable loss remained tangible. Every sensory cue, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the echo of footsteps in the hallways, the distant sounds of camp routines, served as a reminder that life and death were intertwined in ways she could neither predict nor influence, reinforcing the acute awareness that the endurance of her child rested not only in the resilience of the womb, but in the deliberate and unflinching choices of those entrusted with medical care. The days blended into a tense continuum where observation, preparation, and psychological endurance became inseparable, and where the thin line between hope and despair was defined not by ideology or past allegiance, but by the immediate presence of skill, care, and deliberate human choice.
On the 8th day of continuous observation, the subtle tension that had been a constant companion erupted into acute crisis. In the early hours, she awoke to a sharp, stabbing pain in her lower abdomen, radiating with alarming intensity through her back and down her legs. Each contraction-like surge brought with it a dread that transcended prior fear, a tangible physical manifestation of the danger she had been silently anticipating. She called out, her voice hoarse, carrying across the barracks to the woman in the adjacent cot, who immediately recognized the urgency and alerted the guards. Within minutes, she was helped into a waiting transport, the wheels of the truck rumbling over rain-soaked roads, carrying her swiftly to the medical facility where the doctors had been monitoring her case. The journey, though brief in distance, was laden with psychological weight. Every jolt and turn of the vehicle seemed to echo the precariousness of the life within her. Upon arrival, the medical team moved with practiced urgency, assessing her condition while maintaining a calm precision that belied the high stakes. The doctor, who had been her constant during the preceding week, noted her distress immediately, his expression grave yet measured, and began the detailed evaluation that would determine the immediacy and nature of intervention. The preliminary assessment revealed the placental function had declined precipitously, oxygen delivery to the fetus severely compromised, and any further delay threatened complete loss. The young mother's mind raced, remembering every lesson from her past nursing experience, the fragile thresholds of survival for premature infants, the suddenness with which fetal distress could escalate into catastrophe, and the irreversible consequences of inaction. She was acutely aware of the limitations of the facility, rudimentary equipment compared to a metropolitan hospital, a lack of advanced neonatal support, and the ever-present uncertainty that the scarcity of wartime resources imposed on every medical decision. And yet, the doctors proceeded without hesitation, guided by both training and the immediacy of moral responsibility. The decision was stark: allow natural progression with almost certain fetal death, or initiate emergency surgical intervention under suboptimal conditions, each choice carrying profound risks to both mother and child. As she was prepped for surgery, antiseptic cleansing and spinal anesthesia marked the transition from observation to intervention. The sensory experience was overwhelming: the sharp chemical smell of disinfectant, the coarse texture of surgical drapes, the cold metal of instruments, and the low murmur of clinical communication in the background. Every detail reinforced the gravity of the procedure and the razor-thin margins separating life from death. The surgeon's voice was calm, directive, and deliberate, explaining the process of cesarean delivery, the risks of premature birth, hemorrhage, infection, and the limitations imposed by the facility. For her, understanding these words did little to alleviate the anxiety. Comprehension heightened the awareness of vulnerability rather than providing comfort. Yet within that same procedural clarity existed a subtle, unspoken assurance. These men and women, despite her status as a prisoner, were committed to the preservation of life. The operation began with precise coordination.
Hands moved with mechanical expertise, instruments were transferred efficiently, and anesthetic management maintained maternal awareness while minimizing pain. She felt the tension of every movement, the unusual pressure, the unfamiliar sensations, and a strange paradoxical reassurance in the calculated diligence surrounding her. Outside the immediate surgical environment, the camp continued its own routines, distant but tangible, the footsteps of guards, the clatter of supplies, and the quiet, persistent rhythm of life continuing around the facility. These peripheral sounds served as a reminder that her personal struggle existed within a larger, indifferent world, and that the outcome of the operation was contingent upon the convergence of skill, timing, and human attention, rather than fate alone. Minutes expanded into what felt like hours. Every shift of the surgeon's hands, every adjustment of instruments, every spoken directive carrying the weight of consequence. The young mother's mind oscillated between fear, hope, and helplessness, grappling with the knowledge that she had no agency in this critical moment beyond her willingness to endure and cooperate. The room itself became a crucible of tension and potential, the fluorescent glare of overhead lights illuminating the stark environment, the sterile smell of the operating field, a constant reminder of both vulnerability and meticulous control. She thought of the home she would never return to in the same way, the streets of her destroyed city, the absent family members, the societal collapse that had led her to this point, but none of these could detract from the immediacy of life pressing against death in this room. And then, in a moment suspended between anticipation and dread, the initial cry emerged, a faint, fragile sound that immediately anchored her to the reality that the child, against all odds, had entered the world. The doctors worked quickly, securing the infant's airway, monitoring vital signs, and transferring the child to improvised neonatal support. She could not yet see the infant, only hear the thin, desperate sound of a life asserting itself, a sound that both shattered and elevated the tension of the past week into an instantaneous, overwhelming acknowledgement of survival against expectation. The interplay of relief, fear, and gratitude washed over her in waves, leaving her physically exhausted, emotionally raw, yet anchored to the tangible evidence that life could persist even amidst the worst of circumstances, sustained not by ideology, but by deliberate, practiced human choice.
In the hours following the emergency delivery, the young mother was moved to a recovery room, her body weak and trembling from both physical trauma and the emotional intensity of the preceding ordeal. She lay upon a narrow cot, the coarse blankets beneath her providing minimal comfort, while the sterile scent of antiseptic lingered heavily in the air, a constant reminder of the clinical environment she could neither control nor fully comprehend. Outside the thin walls, the camp persisted in its regimented rhythm, the faint clatter of metal doors, the shuffle of feet across gravel pathways, and the distant hum of other prisoners' movements formed a backdrop of continuity amidst her fragile existence. Her thoughts were consumed by the infant she had delivered, the tiny, fragile life whose survival now depended on technology she barely understood and caregivers she had been taught to mistrust. Through the glass partition, she could hear the soft whir of incubators and the muffled murmurs of nurses, each sound a delicate thread tethering hope to reality. She remembered her prior experiences as a nurse in Berlin, where life and death had been measured with tools that were rudimentary yet sufficient, but nothing she had encountered could have prepared her for the combination of vulnerability and reliance she now experienced as a mother. Every breath she took was accompanied by an internal calculation. Could the child breathe steadily, maintain warmth, and endure the precarious first hours outside the womb? Every step of care observed from the nurses, the careful positioning of the infant, the precise adjustment of oxygen supply, the gentle monitoring of temperature, was a tangible manifestation of the complex ballet between fragility and resilience that defined neonatal survival. The young woman's guilt and gratitude were inseparable. The very people who represented the military force that had destroyed her homeland were now preserving the life of her child
with deliberate attention and skill. She reflected on the incongruity of this reality, the dissonance between past indoctrination and present experience. She considered the collapse of her own nation, the absence of effective medical care, the pervasive scarcity, and the countless children who had perished without intervention, each thought a contrast to the careful nurture she now witnessed. Every detail mattered: the subtle rise and fall of the infant's chest, the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment, the temperature readings maintained with exacting diligence. She watched, barely breathing, as a nurse adjusted a blanket, checking the skin's warmth and the alignment of delicate tubes delivering sustenance and oxygen. Time stretched in this space, each moment weighted with significance. Memories of destruction outside the camp, the rubble-filled streets of Berlin, the silent homes, the unburied dead invaded her awareness, juxtaposed with the meticulous, almost gentle care being provided within the walls of the camp. Her mind raced, calculating probabilities, recalling signs of distress, and anticipating potential complications. The medical staff worked quietly, but with unwavering attention, anticipating every need and responding with preemptive skill. The young mother realized that the line separating life from death in these fragile first hours was infinitesimally thin, and every choice, every movement, every detail of care carried profound consequence. Despite her physical exhaustion, she found herself alert in ways she had not imagined possible. Eyes tracing every action, heart beating in anxious rhythm with the infant's own fragile pulse. Outside, the camp's environment persisted, indifferent to her personal drama, the rhythmic pounding of distant work, the occasional shouted commands, the rustling of uniforms. But inside, life and death were being negotiated with meticulous human intervention. Each interaction between nurse and child underscored the deliberate choice of care over neglect, precision over chance, and compassion over indifference. She acknowledged, with a complex mixture of relief and lingering fear, that survival in this moment was the result of skill applied under pressure, decisions made with both technical expertise and moral resolve. The infant's soft, insistent cries, though thin and fragile, became an anchor to reality, confirming that life had persisted against overwhelming odds. The young mother's own body was a vessel of both trauma and triumph, her mind oscillating between gratitude for those who preserved life and an unshakable awareness of the wider devastation from which she had been momentarily insulated. Every second spent watching, listening, and processing the infant's responses reinforced the fragile interdependence of human skill, timing, and the relentless unpredictability of life in a post-conflict environment. And so, in the quiet intensity of that recovery room, she began to comprehend the full magnitude of what had occurred. A life that should have been extinguished had been preserved not by ideology or allegiance, but by deliberate, skilled, and compassionate action amidst the machinery of war.
Over the following days, the young mother established a tenuous routine, a careful balance between her own fragile recovery and the continuous observation of the infant's delicate health. Each morning began with the measured footsteps of nurses entering the recovery room, their faces calm, their movements precise, and their attention unwavering. They checked vital signs, adjusted incubator settings, and documented every detail of the infant's weight, oxygen levels, and responses, while she sat nearby, scarcely moving, observing, and learning to interpret the subtle cues of life that she had never anticipated needing to read with such intensity. The child's breaths were shallow, yet persistent. The tiny hands flexed, curled, and relaxed with a rhythm that marked survival, while the soft whir of air from the incubator became a constant accompaniment to the hours of waiting. Outside the recovery room, the camp persisted in its daily routines, the steady march of women performing chores, the distant calls of guards, the low murmur of conversations in broken languages, all elements of ordinary life continuing in parallel with an extraordinary struggle within a single confined space.
Meals were brought in trays, modest yet nourishing, each bite a reminder of the tenuous provision that allowed both mother and child to persist. She ate cautiously, aware that her own sustenance was intrinsically linked to the infant's well-being, yet even this simple act carried the weight of guilt. She was nourished in abundance, while families in her homeland endured scarcity and starvation. Her thoughts returned frequently to the ruins of her city, the streets she had traversed, and the absent faces of her family, each memory juxtaposed against the careful care being extended to her child in this foreign land. Despite the ongoing fear, a fragile trust began to form, not of the nation that had once been her enemy, but in the individuals who applied their knowledge, skill, and deliberate attention to preserving life without prejudice. She noticed the subtle ways in which the nurses anticipated needs, adjusted equipment preemptively, and communicated with each other in quiet, efficient coordination, a choreography that sustained life in the most precarious circumstances. Each observation, each monitoring session reinforced the reality that survival was not guaranteed, but was contingent upon continuous vigilance, the precise application of skill, and the unwavering presence of those entrusted with care. The young mother remained intensely alert, learning to read vital signs and subtle indicators of distress, translating professional observation into a personal language of hope and fear. She spent hours at the incubator, pressing her hands near the glass, feeling the warmth radiating through the thin barrier, listening to the soft, persistent cries, each one a fragile assertion of existence. Sleep remained elusive, interrupted by anxiety and the necessity of monitoring the infant's response to temperature, oxygen, and nourishment. The psychological burden was relentless. Each passing hour held the dual potential of triumph or catastrophe, and her mind continuously replayed scenarios in which life could be lost with imperceptible suddenness. Outside, the camp's environment continued largely indifferent to her personal struggle, yet every distant sound, the shuffle of laundry, the clang of utensils, the low hum of distant voices all became part of a larger sensory landscape, a constant reminder of life's continuity beyond the immediate crisis. She reflected on her previous nursing experience with a mixture of helplessness and irony. The skills that once allowed her to administer care to others now served primarily to interpret the meticulous efforts of strangers on her child's behalf. Trust, she realized, had become inseparable from observation, a cautious acknowledgement that deliberate action by competent hands was the single most critical factor in sustaining life. Each day concluded with a quiet assessment, the infant's breaths, movements, and responses recorded, weight logged, and care instructions reviewed, forming a rhythm of vigilance that mirrored the internal beat of fear, hope, and gratitude. Gradually, subtle improvements emerged. The infant's color stabilized, breathing grew more regular, and occasional movements became more pronounced, indicators that life was persisting, that fragile endurance was possible under deliberate human intervention. These small victories, though measured and cautious, became profound milestones, each one reinforcing the realization that even amidst devastation and captivity, human skill, attention, and moral choice could create a narrow corridor through which life might persist.
As the infant grew stronger, the young mother began to experience a cautious shift in perspective, from relentless anxiety to a tentative sense of agency over her new reality. Each day, she learned to anticipate the infant's needs, the subtle tension in tiny limbs signaling hunger, the brief changes in breathing indicating discomfort, and the minute shifts in color that demanded immediate attention. Nurses continued to guide her with quiet authority, teaching her techniques to manage. As the infant grew stronger, the young mother began to experience a cautious shift in perspective, from relentless anxiety to a tentative sense of agency over her new reality. Each day, she learned to anticipate the infant's needs, the subtle tension in tiny limbs signaling hunger, the brief changes in breathing indicating discomfort, and the minute shifts in color that demanded immediate attention. Nurses continued to guide her with quiet authority,
teaching her techniques to manage feeding, temperature regulation, and gentle handling while maintaining sterile precautions in an environment far removed from home. The camp, still a place of surveillance and regimented routines, receded into the background, its barracks, fences, and watchtowers becoming peripheral scenery to the intense focus of survival and care within the recovery ward. She began to understand the complexity of neonatal development under precarious conditions, how every gram of weight gained and every stable breath represented both a triumph over physiological fragility and a testament to the deliberate vigilance of those providing care. Sleep remained sporadic, interrupted by the need to check monitors, adjust incubator settings, and ensure the infant was warm and nourished. Yet each night brought incremental progress. Subtle movements became more confident, breathing more regular, and responses more consistent. Outside, the sounds of daily camp life, women carrying water, the murmur of conversation, the distant commands of guards, provided a strange juxtaposition, ordinary life proceeding in parallel to an extraordinary struggle unfolding in a microcosm within a single room. Letters from home, when they arrived, reminded her of the broader devastation and the unrelenting scarcity that had characterized her family's existence, highlighting the stark contrast between her present security and the ongoing suffering beyond the camp's perimeter. Despite these reminders, the young mother's focus remained unwavering on the fragile life she held within her vigil. The medical staff's continued diligence reinforced the importance of careful observation. Minute changes in color, subtle irregularities in respiration, and slight reductions in movement were all critical markers that could dictate immediate intervention. She observed and absorbed every technique, every instruction, transforming her passive survival into active participation in the infant's care. There emerged a growing tentative sense of trust, not naive but measured and conditional, based on repeated demonstrations of competence, empathy, and unwavering attention by the caregivers. The infant's incremental progress allowed her to engage emotionally without surrendering to fear, cultivating a cautious bond that had previously been overshadowed by uncertainty and dread. She became attuned to the rhythms of life within the incubator, recognizing that the thin line between stability and crisis required constant vigilance, deliberate action, and a willingness to endure personal exhaustion in service of another life. Moments of fragile joy emerged, a consistent cry signaling strength, a small weight gain, the warmth of skin-to-glass contact through the incubator barrier, all subtle affirmations that life was persisting against extraordinary odds. The psychological burden remained, but these milestones introduced a measure of hope that coexisted with the ever-present awareness of vulnerability. Reflection on her own experiences, both as a nurse and as a survivor of societal collapse, deepened her understanding of human resilience, skill, and the moral imperative embedded within care, the deliberate choice to act to preserve life irrespective of nationality, circumstance, or past enmities. By the end of each day, she felt a mixture of profound fatigue, cautious relief, and the subtle formation of a protective bond that was as much emotional as it was practical. In this controlled microcosm, she began to understand the extraordinary significance of structured vigilance, attentive skill, and human compassion, all converging to sustain life in the most challenging of circumstances. Her perspective expanded beyond immediate survival to recognition that the persistent presence of competent, deliberate, and morally engaged individuals could create narrow pathways through which fragile life might endure, even within the harsh confines of a post-war environment.
By the second week, the infant's survival had become increasingly probable, yet the young mother understood that the margin for error remained perilously narrow, and every detail of care carried immense consequence. The recovery room, once a strange and sterile environment, now felt like a controlled arena where life persisted only through constant attention, measured action, and the continuous application of medical knowledge under conditions far from ideal. Nurses moved with a quiet efficiency, their hands deftly adjusting incubator temperatures, monitoring oxygen levels, and recording every fluctuation in the infant's weight and vital signs. The mother, though still physically fragile, participated more actively in care, learning the precise timing and technique required for feeding, the careful observation of color and movement, and the subtle cues that indicated discomfort or distress. Each interaction demanded vigilance, yet the rhythm of these tasks gradually became a stabilizing framework in a world that had previously offered only chaos and uncertainty. The surrounding camp, with its wooden barracks, guard towers, and distant shuffle of daily routines, receded into an almost irrelevant backdrop, a reminder that life and death often unfolded in isolated microcosms regardless of the larger machinery of war. Letters from home arriving intermittently reinforced the sharp contrast between her present circumstances and the devastation endured by family and neighbors, highlighting the extraordinary fortune, or perhaps the deliberate intervention, that allowed survival in this controlled environment. With each day, subtle improvements in the infant's health, more stable breathing, stronger movements, incremental weight gain, were celebrated quietly, yet with profound relief, forming milestones that were measured in grams, breaths, and visible signs of life. Sleep remained sporadic, frequently interrupted by the necessity of monitoring the child's fragile condition, but the mother gradually internalized the rhythms of survival, learning to anticipate potential crises and respond with deliberate caution. The nurse's understated guidance and consistent competence fostered a delicate trust, allowing her to engage in the care process with confidence, tempered by persistent awareness of fragility. Observing each minute action, the careful adjustment of blankets, the delicate handling of tubing, the soft communication of status updates between staff, she recognized the intricate choreography required to sustain life within the precarious environment of a post-conflict camp. The psychological weight of responsibility was immense. She understood that errors, even minor, could have irreversible consequences. Yet, through observation, repetition, and guided participation, she transformed anxiety into focused vigilance, cultivating a practical understanding of life-sustaining procedures and the moral resolve required to maintain them. The infant's incremental gains, though measured and cautious, provided continuous affirmation of human skill and deliberate compassion, reinforcing the sense that careful intervention could override the chaotic forces of prior destruction. As days passed, small rituals, feeding at precise intervals, gently adjusting blankets, tracking vital signs, became both necessity and reassurance, embedding structure into a previously unstable reality. Each success, however minor, represented the convergence of human skill, attention, and moral choice, demonstrating that life could persist even under extreme circumstances when guided by deliberate care. The mother's observation sharpened. Every subtle shift in tone, temperature, or movement became a critical data, a critical factor in predicting and sustaining life. Through this disciplined vigilance, she gradually forged an intimate understanding of the interplay between fragility and resilience, mortality and intervention, and began to internalize the profound truth that survival was as much the result of deliberate human action as of innate vitality. Within the quiet intensity of the recovery room, amidst equipment, monitors, and unspoken attention, the mother witnessed the fragile persistence of life, understanding fully that each careful intervention was both a technical and moral assertion against the indifference of the broader world outside. By the third week, the infant's condition had stabilized to the point where cautious optimism could exist alongside the persistent undercurrent of anxiety. The young mother, now more confident yet still vigilant, participated in nearly every aspect of care, from feeding to temperature regulation, observing every subtle signal the child displayed. The nurse's presence remained constant, guiding her with precision, their movements efficient and understated, each action deliberate to maintain an environment in which the smallest error could be fatal. The recovery room, once alien and intimidating, had become a disciplined microcosm of life-sustaining care, where every breath, every movement, every tiny weight gain carried profound significance. She noted the delicate rhythm of the infant's chest, the tiny flecks of fingers and toes, the shifting expressions that signaled discomfort or contentment, each cue interpreted through a lens sharpened by both fear and attentive study. Outside the controlled space, the camp continued its routines, the hum of daily work, the distant calls of guards, and the muted chatter of women performing essential tasks, creating a faint but constant reminder that life persisted in a broader, indifferent world. Letters from Germany arriving sporadically contrasted sharply with the controlled security of the camp. Stories of destruction, hunger, and uncertainty framed the infant's survival as both extraordinary and precarious. Each incremental improvement in health, a slightly stronger cry, steadier respiration, a small increase in weight, was recognized as a critical milestone, celebrated quietly but with profound relief. Sleep remained fragmented, interrupted by the necessity of monitoring, yet these hours of vigilance fostered an intimate knowledge of life's fragility and resilience, as well as an appreciation for the structured interventions that enabled survival. The mother internalized the lessons of careful observation, precise response, and disciplined care, understanding that the survival of her child was not only contingent on biological strength, but on sustained human intervention guided by expertise and moral responsibility. She observed the nurse's nuanced coordination, the quiet exchange of information, the subtle adjustments of equipment, and recognized the extraordinary discipline required to preserve life under constrained circumstances. The act of caregiving became a rhythm, a choreography that combined technical skill, emotional endurance, and moral commitment, creating a fragile equilibrium in which life could persist. Over time, the mother noticed the infant gaining weight steadily, movements becoming more vigorous, and responsiveness increasing, small but undeniable indicators of resilience and the success of deliberate care. Each day, the interplay between vulnerability and endurance reinforced a growing awareness. The persistence of life in this context was neither accidental nor guaranteed. It was the result of continuous, skilled, and morally guided action. She understood that each moment of attention, each adjustment, each intervention contributed directly to sustaining life, shaping her perception of survival as an active, demanding responsibility. The surrounding world of the camp, with its structures, routines, and distant hum of activity, faded into the periphery, highlighting the intensity and significance of this intimate, life-preserving sphere. By the end of the third week, a cautious bond had formed, not only between mother and child, but between the young woman and the caregivers whose skill and moral resolve had facilitated this fragile survival. She began to grasp the extraordinary reality that life could endure even amidst devastation, provided that deliberate human effort, attention, and compassion were applied consistently and without hesitation. In the quiet hours, watching the infant's steady breaths, she felt a profound awareness of both the fragility of life and the extraordinary impact of human choice and expertise in shaping the line between survival and loss. As weeks turned into months, the young mother and her infant settled into a fragile but increasingly stable rhythm, a rhythm defined by vigilant care, measured intervention, and the slow rebuilding of trust in a world that had previously offered only uncertainty and loss. Each day became a careful calibration of observation and action, feeding schedules meticulously maintained,
temperatures closely monitored, breathing and vital signs tracked with unwavering attention. The nurses' guidance remained a constant, quiet presence, their expertise now internalized by the mother, who had transformed from passive observer into competent caretaker, capable of interpreting the infant's subtle cues and responding with precision. The camp, once an intimidating landscape of barracks, guard towers, and distant activity, receded to a muted backdrop, its presence acknowledged but no longer commanding her attention. Survival had shifted focus to this controlled microcosm, where life was sustained through deliberate effort and moral commitment. Letters from Germany continued to arrive sporadically, each missive reinforcing the contrast between her secure, if constrained, environment and the devastation that had consumed her homeland. Cities in ruins, families dispersed, starvation pervasive. Yet within the recovery ward, the infant thrived, steadily gaining weight, breathing more robustly, and exhibiting increasingly vigorous responses to stimuli, each milestone a testament to the convergence of human skill, careful attention, and compassion. The mother's own health gradually improved, the scars of childbirth fading as her confidence and capability grew, and the quiet bond between her and the caregivers deepened, formed through shared vigilance, mutual trust, and the extraordinary demands of sustaining life in precarious conditions. Observing the infant's growth and resilience, she reflected on the profound implications of deliberate care in the aftermath of destruction, understanding that the line between survival and loss had been navigated not by chance, but by sustained human intervention, technical skill, and moral choice. Each successful breath, each incremental gain, each moment of calm yet attentive observation became an affirmation that life could endure even amidst the ruins of war, provided that humanity and skill were applied without hesitation. The realization that enemies could become protectors and that mercy and deliberate action could overcome the consequences of violence and neglect shaped a new understanding of trust, gratitude, and moral responsibility. As she held her thriving infant, feeling warmth, strength, and movement that only weeks prior had seemed impossible, the young mother comprehended the profound contradiction of her situation. Life had persisted against extraordinary odds, nurtured by those once imagined as adversaries, and preserved through a combination of vigilance, expertise, and unyielding moral commitment. In final reflection, she understood that the microcosm of care within the recovery ward was emblematic of a larger truth, that even in the aftermath of immense devastation, human choice, compassion, and skill could reclaim life from the brink of loss. The echoes of fear and uncertainty that had initially dominated her experience gradually gave way to a tempered, resilient hope, reinforced by every steady breath, every measured gain, and every demonstration of deliberate care. This quiet triumph, forged through observation, intervention, and human empathy, became a testament not only to survival, but to the enduring capacity for compassion to transcend the boundaries of nationality, enmity, and circumstance. As she reflected on the harrowing journey from despair to cautious optimism, the young mother recognized that the survival of her infant was not merely a matter of biology, but a testament to the extraordinary impact of focused human agency and moral courage. In the stillness of the recovery room, with her infant safe and steadily growing, she finally understood that life, when nurtured with unwavering attention and deliberate care, could persist even in the most challenging and uncertain circumstances, offering a lasting affirmation of resilience, compassion, and the enduring human spirit. The story of these weeks, marked by vigilance, skill, and extraordinary moral choice, would remain with her always, a quiet but powerful reminder that survival, hope, and life itself often depend on the deliberate acts of those willing to uphold them against overwhelming odds.